Thank you, Anne, and the Society for inviting me back to this great museum, this great city, to share my interests and my scholarship with you. I'm always delighted to come here. This is my third time, and I'm just really thrilled that I can share this story about this princess with you and the multiple ways that I have researched her and looked at her through various lenses. I wanted to also say that this is the cover of the book that came out last November, in which my article is featured. And I wanted to quickly just talk about the title of the book so that you understand the lecture today a little bit more specifically. So the title is Speaking of the Self, Gender, Performance, and Autobiography in South Asia. And basically, my princess, Jahanara, Begam, Begam, by the way, just means mistress, just so you know, and Jahanara was the name that her father gave her. So when we think about her and we think about these early modern women, many Muslims and non-Muslims, you know, the way that they spoke about themselves, and I put spoke or speak in quotes, was through a very personalized way. It was not in a manner that was prevalent or formalized or instituted, but in a way that was very artful and sort of acceptable for women to speak of themselves. And they did it through performance, and performance, again, you have to think broadly. Performance is not dance per se, or you know, a theatrics, but really about how their contributions play a part in the landscape among other contributions made by men or leaders or sovereigns or emperors. And then autobiography was another domain that was strictly for males and for the elite males, and of course for emperors to have you know, the prerogative to write about themselves. Women, how dare they write about themselves at this time, because it would be too bold an enunciation, it would be too revealing, too transparent about their gender, about their selves. So when we look at these three aspects, we just keep those in mind when I go through what and how Jahanara Begum also articulated herself, how she spoke of herself in the 17th century as the consort and queen/confidant to her very powerful emperor father, Shah Jahan, who built the Taj Mahal, if many of you may know or recognize. So moving right along, most scholarship that you may have heard of or read has really centered on the Islamic past, whether it emerged from an indigenous Muslim tradition or was part of a European Orientalist tradition. And this scholarship largely ignored the existence of women, particularly in places of power, and especially as patrons of monuments. So this omission results partly is due to the lack of primary sources, meaning actual books that were written by women or books that were written about women. And also because European scholars had very little access to elite Muslim women. However, generations of scholars then concluded as a result of this that Muslim women were insignificant in shaping their history, their culture, or their landscape. In the last few decades, feminist scholars and historians in general across various disciplines have studied the manner in which these women have articulated their selves, their authority, and their personas in very personalized ways, but also through the prevalent modes of masculinity that were in the landscape. And in this manner, they articulated their authority, they articulated their personalities, and also themselves. And these examples included autobiographies that were not the official autobiographies like the emperors, or they were patrons of public buildings, and or they performed their prescribed roles in their secular and sacred duties as elite females in the 17th century. So out of this scholarship then emerges a new archetypal Muslim woman and elite woman, and it renders these very traditional frameworks to be very narrowly defined and based on outdated paradigms or constructs. And of course, those are now fast approaching their decline. And as Anne said in her very generous opening of my research, I am the niche market on Jahanara Begum. And it's easy to become that because the sources are so few, and the search is so long that often scholars opt to go and research the emperors, which of course are highly documented. So with this type of scholarship, and of course there's other scholars who are doing similar work on women, we are going to make this paradigm outdated if it hasn't already. I wanted to just stop for a second. I found this painting and this work, which is the back of a mirror, in the collection here at the Asian Art Museum. And as we go along in the lecture, I wanted to explain about paintings that you often see of women. As I said, access to women in the harem, the imperial harem, was not allowed by either Europeans, but also even the indigenous, members of the palace, and especially artists were not allowed entry to princesses or empresses. However, they were given articles of their clothing, their furniture, their accessories, and from that, often artists made these types of often profile views, if not entirely profile views of women that are generally set against plain backgrounds, and these are very typical of the works that come from this era, in the Mughal era, and they especially emerged in large numbers during the Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan's reign. And prior to that period, the solitary figure of women had rarely been the sole focus of a painting. You would find emperors in this type of stance and this type of painting, but rarely women. So it's really between Jahangir, who was, gaga over his wife Nur Jahan, and often they were found frolicking in a variety of landscapes. Between Jahangir and Shah Jahan, you really see a very large body of work that includes women, and it's often in this type of, this type of format and this formalism. And this particular female court attendant, she's not a princess, and we know she's a court attendant. That's another thing that you may be able to figure out, is because she's holding a tray, meaning she's a servant, she's carrying something to someone, and the tray includes a small covered bowl, a sprinkler for perfumed water, and possibly, also some little snacks. And her skirt, which is, is a very gauzy organza material, is finely pleated. It has gold trims on it, as well as her garments above. And she has a very highly ornate embroidered sash. And it reflects the decorative nature of many of Shah Jahan era paintings, but it also speaks of the importance of nature in terms of the border and also on the design here. But from her dress alone, we can figure out that she is a servant to a high-level, elite female, that she's not just serving a sub-imperial, for a lack of better words. And so, so during the Shah Jahan era especially, there was a very formalized sense of his power, and it was done through the consistency and the absolutism of motifs and decorative elements. So you'll find a consistency of nature, and nature that isn't abstracted but fully realized. You can see how the flowers are all in a different element or place in whether they're dying or in full bloom, because they are fully realized. They're not just abstracted. This is a lot more abstracted. So this is the context in which Jahanara becomes the consort queen to her father and his confidant. He is really strengthening the empire. He is creating an imperial ideology that is fraught with idioms and motifs and symbolism and objects that all speak of him, even in his absence. So you're going to see a lot of these types of elements as we go along, but I also wanted to provide the context in which this 17-year-old comes into her role, into her mother's role as the keeper of the imperial seal and also as the consort to her father. So there aren't many paintings that actually say, hi, this is Jahanara Begum. But as I said, we can, as art historians, locate many of these paintings within a certain time period, and particularly the formal elements. This is a painting at the MFA in Boston that I found and really looked at critically in terms of its formal elements, and particularly the background, which is of this patina color, of a color that is very difficult to mix for an artist because it requires the white lead, fraught paint, and blues and greens, and also crushed turquoise to create this kind of color. And so it was really the domain of the imperial family. From that and other elements in the painting, the profile view, the very highly decorated elements on her dress, and also her face, which has many Persianized features as well as Indianized features, and the fact that she's holding a lotus flower, a very important element, speaks of who she is, and the lotus flower will come back later when we look at her patronage. It's a very unusual element to include in a mosque, for example, because of its relationship to Buddhism and Hinduism. And for her to hold that is really speaking of who she is and what she admires and what her affinities are. And we'll come to that in a second, or later. So in this work, in this talk, I speak of how she has displayed and exercised her power and her authority as the consort and the counterpart to her father's power, but also her piety and her religiosity, which was so important and paramount for women, elite women, to show in a very public manner that they are also upholding the religious ideals of empire. And so the power, the piety, and also then the poetry, meaning book production. She didn't write an autobiography, but she did write a Sufi autobiographical treatise where she uses the religious vernacular to speak of herself. And this is that artful way that I was talking about earlier, to not fully expose yourself, but to weave yourself into an accepted norm of religion to then speak of yourself. And again, we'll talk about that later in the I'll talk about that in the talk. So in this way, she is contradicting the notion of invisibility of early modern women and their powers, and hopefully I will provide irrefutable evidence today to show that that is not true. So the case of women, I do want to make it very clear, they did not exercise direct sovereignty, particularly through masculine modes, as I mentioned. That's very rare in Mughal history. We do have an elite Mughal woman, Nur Jahan, as I mentioned, who married, she was the 21st wife to Jahangir. She did, of course, announce herself in a very bombastic way, and for that she was reviled. And for that, she was held in contempt. And for that, she is not remembered kindly in the annals of history. So all those aspects of being bold and being bombastic in the articulation as a female were exercised by Jahanara. They're living at the same time because it's her grandfather's wife. But she's also observing and noticing and listening to her father's comments about this woman and being careful not to make the same errors or missteps. And now I'm mentioning all these names. I thought I should probably, I don't know how much you know about Mughal history, but I thought we should just go back. This is the classic period, meaning after 1707, the Mughal Empire is in decline, but it starts in 1526 with Babur and then successively ends with Aurangzeb, who was, by the way, the youngest son to Shah Jahan and the youngest brother to Jahanara Begum. But what you'll see here are not only dates and names, but also biographies of these emperors. And there weren't one, but there were numerous and several copies done by various authors and historians and then illustrated by different ateliers within the Mughal Empire. And you can see that Aurangzeb had none. And the reason, of course, has to do with his extreme concept and perspective and notion about what Islam really is, and that it should be much more humble, should be more impoverished in nature, and should be more modest, and to record and to archive and document yourself is considered the ultimate form of conceit, and therefore he did not want his little editor to, who was very upset about it, and there's a whole dissertation on the editor and his commiserations, because he also would have gained the fame that the other authors had gained by writing these biographies. So Aurangzeb is at the end of that line, but Babur starts the line. He actually invades India in 1526 and dies 4 years later, but manages to write his biography. And the history that predates the Mughals is the Timurids, and it's the empire that was, its origins are in Iran, and so the Mughals are coming from Iran as Timurids that then settle in India, in the northwest part of India, so you can kind of see how they accommodated their empire and when they did it and who did it especially. And so nearly, they started out here. This is the earliest aspect of their invasion and their settlement, and Lahore as well as Delhi and Agra are the cities that we're going to be traveling through in terms of the monuments that they contributed. But you can see in successive leadership, they managed to almost get the entirety of India, but not quite. So in addition to the monuments that I'm going to show you that Jahanara commissioned and those that spoke of herself, she also wrote a book, 2 books actually, or treatises. They were short, they're not illustrated, and they were not longer than 35 pages. The one that is in the Bodleian Library, which is at Oxford University, is this one. It's called Mudas al-Arwa. It's written right here, and that basically is an anthology of a compilation of all the Sufi saints, starting from Prophet Muhammad all the way to Chishti, who was the resident saint for the Mughals, and she does this because she. By the way, this scan is from the British Library, even though the original copy isn't kept there. So she does this. She compiles this and writes. This is in her writing. this because she wants to prove not only herself as an educated princess, but also that she's knowledgeable of the history of the saints, and that further legitimizes her spiritual authority, that she knows who they are, she understands the history, and she understands the connections of this history to them, the Mughals, through the Sufi saints. And that's a very important lineage that needed to be, one needs to understand if they are to claim a certain spiritual authority, which of course she does, and you'll understand that as we go on. So in addition to Munis al-Larva, the manuscript that I located that had been mentioned in many articles is the Risala Sahibiya. And Risala just means treatise, and Sahibiya is Begam Saiba, meaning the mistress, who is Jahanara. She was also called the Begam Saiba in Chronicles. So it was her treatise, and that one is the Sufi autobiographical treatise where she speaks of herself, and she speaks of her legacy, and she speaks of lighting the light of the Timuriya, meaning the Timurids, and hence the Mughals, into eternity. So you see what's happening here. She's representing herself, but she's also an agent of the imperial authority. She is designated and given the charge to make those assertions of being, having a particular authority both in the sacred and the secular realm. So she's doing it through various means. Writing, as I will explain and show you, was a very important part of the imperial ideology during the Mughal era. I already showed you that all of the emperors wrote and documented, and she wasn't allowed to write about herself in that bold manner, but she chose these other modes to represent herself. In addition, this idea of writing was very important because it consistently supported the inheritance of power and really established empire. So every time they wrote a biography, it was kept in the imperial libraries, and successive generations would have access to them and read them and look at the illustrated paintings, and in a very blatant way, it was a form of counsel. These biographies with illustrations and the quotidian details of the emperor's world were essentially forms of counsel for the next ruler. Like, this is what you should be doing, and this is how. Here's some images. This is what I did. This is what I gained. This is what didn't happen. This is what happened. And so they were a form of counsel. And again, Jahanara as a princess is not going to write in that detail, but she is going to express herself. And in her Sahibiya, which is her own personal Sufi treatise, she does speak of the ultimate importance, which is to light their light on the sacred realm into eternity. So they may be doing all these worldly things, like gaining all this land and invading India and having all these riches, but those are mundane material aspects of success. What about the sacred aspect? Okay, she said, I'll take that on, and I will light that light. You should also know that the division of labor, both in the sacred and secular realms, are still at the bombastic, large, high-profile capital stage, are the men's domain. So she has to, again, think about that and do it in an artful manner. So you also find that these legacy-building ways that the Mughals had employed were records. This is a patrilineal record of, biographical record of the various Mughal leaders. For example, this at the center is Jahangir, and this is his son, Shah Jahan, so he's looking towards him because he's going to succeed him, and then he traces his line to Timur, the Lame, as you may have heard of, and Tamerlane, as he's called, and that, of course, is the legacy that came from Iran. Another aspect that was very important to the Mughals was their relationship to Sufi saints, who were also called sheikhs. So you can see that here we have Emperor Babur with sheikhs and saints, and he's being presented with a book, education, book, writing, objectifying power, objectifying your sacred authority is paramount and important. And so here are not only one sheikh, but also several saints sitting in an audience with Babur to explain that he is not only enshrined on this throne as the emperor, but also has this sacred line and aspect to him that is fully established and fully legitimized. Just as a side note, if you don't know, you can see their faces are very Asianized, like East Asianized, because the Timur is from the line of Genghis Khan, who is, of course, Mongolian. And so you can see that their faces in these miniatures are very East Asianized and therefore represent that heritage of Genghis Khan, and then is further replicated in these paintings. And then Timurs then become the Mughals, and they become combined with Indian features and look the way that they do in the later paintings. It's really interesting. I have 3 sons, and when they were born, they had this blue mark at the base of their back, and it was really strange to me. My first son was born in Japan, in Sapporo. We lived there for 4 years, and the doctor there said, "Oh, Genghis Khan." And I said, "What?" And I said, "Yeah, that's the Genghis Khan mark." And I was like, "I'm from Pakistan, and my husband's a white guy. Like, how did that happen?" And he's like, "Yeah, that's Asian. You're East Asian. You have Mongolian blood." And I didn't think anything of it at the time. And then I reproduced a little more, all boys, and and they all had the blue mark. And it was very interesting. So recently, about 2 months ago, I did 23andMe, because I finally had the time to do something like that. And I'm so excited to see what I'm going to find out, because I'm just, I'm from Pakistan, and my father is from the northwest region of Pakistan, and so even closer to Russia and China. So I'm so curious, and I'll make sure that all of you know later, at a later time. But it is very exciting, and I had forgotten it, but who knows? Something Genghis Khan traits are fighting through. So here we also have paintings that document relationships and the passing of the torch. And so this imperial concept about sovereignty not ending with one line but continuing and being legitimized is also recorded in paintings. And you can see the same East Asianized face and features. And here you see Babur and Humayun, who is his son, and he is telling him about the importance of documentation, of archiving, and he's giving him this book, and they're sitting in a pavilion that is outside with nature surrounding them, because it was so important to them to have that. And so the book production again is something that is documented, and it's something that Jahanara would have had access to. She would have seen it. This was painted in the 16th century, of course, later after Babur's death, and she would have had access to know the importance of what that really means in terms of power. What is interesting is that Humayun, who was the emperor after Babur, his biography was written by his aunt, Gulbadan Begam. It's so unusual, and she's hardly spoken. They hardly talk about her, and she had such an important role. She was the reluctant author, like, "Oh, please don't make me do this," and she was told way after Humayun's death by Akbar that, "I need you to write this book that my father forgot to write." And she said, well, I have no experience. And he said, I trust you. I know you know what you're doing. And so Gulbadan Begum writes the biography for Humayun. And again, it's something that you would miss if you were to study Mughal history, but it's such an important record because now it's through the lens and the filter of a woman about male authority. So that in itself is quite interesting. And again, something that Jahanara would have read and something she would have been aware of, knowing that it is her great-great-aunt, who wrote this and is speaking of an emperor. This painting I found in the collection here at the Asian Art Museum, and again, it speaks of an ascetic, and an ascetic, a sheikh, a Sufi are often considered within the same light. A Sufi, especially, now you would say, well, what if he's just a sadhu, or he could be Hindu ascetic, he could be a Buddhist ascetic? Well, it's because of what he's wearing. Because Sufi, suf means wool in Persian. So often the saints and sheikhs would wear wool. If nothing else, they would have some kind of a wool shawl or a wool mantle, which then designated them as Sufi saints, because the rest of their frazzled look could have been anything else. But if you look at their accessories, then you would know that it's a Sufi saint. So what is interesting about this painting, and you might have noticed right away, is that it doesn't have that lavish display and use of color and ornament and illumination of gold and the all those sort of things that you've seen in the earlier paintings. And that, of course, has to do with the concept of Sufi and the impoverished nature of the relationship that should be direct and unfettered and uncluttered with God. And so this very, I would like to call it an ephemeral painting that kind of disappears and comes and disappears and comes, has a very spiritual resonance. It has a very sort of a flotation manner in terms of the way the figures sit in space, unlike the very highly flourished paintings that are in the emperor's books. Now, I've talked a little bit, I made an expression, which is optical politics. It's a very academic term, and I wanted to make sure you understood it because it's really important for you to know, because you're going to impress all your friends after this lecture by throwing that into the conversation and say, oh, you didn't know what that, oh, let me explain. So here it is. What is optical politics? Well, this is the performance piece of when someone commissions a work of, a huge building, and the choice and the deliberate choice of placing it next to and across from and within the sight lines of a larger, more recognizable structure equates that structure and to that power. So what you're looking at, if you've been to India, this is in Agra, this is the Red Fort, and this is one of the entrances. It has many. And straight across from the entrance is the mosque, which you probably skipped and forgot to go to because the tour guide didn't tell you. And that is Jahanara Begum's mosque. She commissioned this mosque, and that note of her begging to use her own money to commission this mosque is actually noted in Shah Jahan's biography. And so he then creates a forecourt to this bazaar across the way and connects his object of power to her object of power. So this is what optical politics is. What you see next to each other is important. And again, here is Babur, who is reading. And it's really interesting because Akbar, who's the third in line, didn't know how to read, and yet had such an emphasis and understood the importance of writing and archiving and documenting. And Babur is always shown with the book open because it was so important to be learned and to be invested in that learning and to be then projected into that learning through biographies. Now, Jahanara also, of course, understood not only this power of the book and poetry and writing, but also affiliations with Sufi sheikhs and Sufi saints. And what you're looking at here is this, the Sufi saint that she ends up becoming a disciple to. This is her master, and he is Mullah Shah. And you can see the very delicate nature of this painting. I mean, you really have to go close, and I hope that you have a chance to really see these paintings up close, because as you may or may not know, the brush that is used for these miniature paintings that are book size is 3 hairs of a squirrel. 3 hairs of a squirrel, which means this detail right here of the beard is layers and layers and layers and layers of painting, giving it the depth and the 3-dimensional realism and quality that you would expect from looking at a person in front of you. So each hair of his beard and each line of his skin and the wrinkles in his skin are fully, and you can see it here too. So fully realized paintings can only be can be achieved when you have that kind of attention to detail through that type of technique. So Sufi saints are also modeled in a very delicate manner. Now, the ascetic I showed you had no color in the painting, but this one has quite a bit of color and framing, and also is framed in typical multi-cusped arch, which is specific to Mughal architecture. So this already explains his affiliation and association with the Mughal Empire, but further, the highly decorative nature of the painting speaks of his high level and his patronage that comes from an imperial patron, and that of course was Jahanara. And I just wanted to, this is a reproduction of Tamerlane, just in case you haven't come across that painting, just to show that he also has been documented. And so this concept of showing the sovereign with Sufi saints was very important and was practiced throughout each of the leaderships of and through each of the military and political campaigns of each of the emperors. And here we have Jahangir sitting on this throne of an hourglass, which, if you look closely, is a very highly Renaissance styled painting, and that has to do, of course, with the Portuguese who brought the illustrated Bibles to Shah Jahan in hopes that he would convert and the Mughals would convert, and they actually, and also brought to Jahangir and also brought to Akbar, and so you can see through the angels and as well as the illuminated halo, the appropriations that came from the Bible and made it to the sovereign's symbols of power and authority. And of course, the carpet also has many other details and angels, of course, from that European tradition. But what's interesting is the layering of the figures on the side as Jahangir sits in profile and is presented with a book by his sheikh, his saint, the Chishti saint, who is Salim Chishti. He is presenting him with a Sufi manuscript or a book. And then second in line, of course, is the Sultan of Turkey. And third in line is King James. And here's what's interesting. The 3 figures who are Muslim or indigenous or within the construct of the Islamic framework are in profile to show a modesty and a modest demeanor. And King James is looking right at you. And of course, he's English. So I think, these paintings speak volumes in terms of the narrative behind the painting. But it shows also, this is the artist who is presenting his own painting, and this is Bichter, and we hardly ever see the artist represented this detailed in a miniature painting. So even though he's layered at the bottom of this totem pole in the hierarchical ordering, he is very important because he's in the painting. He made it to the painting. He doesn't care if he's last. What do you call the guy who finishes last in his medical class? A doctor. Doesn't matter. Same concept here. So we have the Sufi saint, and then we have the Islamic leadership, and then we have the Westerner who, had to be there, and then we have the artist. So the concept of Sufi saints as being present and important and central to the power of the emperor is clear in these illustrated biographies. And this is Shah Jahan receiving his 3 eldest sons, and I'm sorry I cut off the other, this is Aurangzeb, and he is hugging Dara Shikoh, who is the heir apparent, and then over here is Shuja, and he's probably like, oh, I'm so sick of this. He doesn't even look at me. And that does build up, and actually, I'm not making that up. He actually, there are edicts and journals that Aurangzeb did write through his editor, and he speaks, especially in this one letter, to his sister to say, can't you ask Dad to give me a better position in this, in his government, because I'm doing all the legwork while this guy is writing poetry up in the palace. Can you please help me out here? And she writes back, you have to follow the Islamic etiquette and the Islamic order of the right of inheritance. He is the oldest. He has the right to inherit our father's throne, and you are the youngest, and you have to wait. And so, meanwhile, Aurangzeb has a point, because all of that territory that you saw on the bottom, that was all gained by Aurangzeb and his military might and his military acumen, and he's out there in the in the trenches. And it's true. Dara Shikoh's hanging out, reading Sufi poetry and rewriting the Ramayana and rewriting the Upanishads, and it's important too. And of course, his father wants him nearby because he doesn't want him to get killed. He's the heir apparent. So you can see how these things do generate a certain contempt and hate. But irregardless, that was a sidebar. I wanted to show that the Sufis are flanked along the chain of his command, and that's the chain right here, that they are upholding the chain, that they are part of the power, and they are necessary. And by the way, the 2 animals, this is a lamb, and these are lions, and the old adage of, what is it? I think it's even in scripture that the lambs will lie with the lions when there is peace in the world, and that's it. So you see this imperial ideology and the propaganda through image, which is that with his power, peace will be ensured, but the intermediaries need to be there, and they're the saints, and therefore he is a just king who will be able to accommodate that in his empire. This is also from the collection here, and this is in a portrait of Aurangzeb, the youngest in the Mughal line, as I mentioned. And it's very interesting because he's wearing boots, where often the emperors are wearing slippers, kind of showing their very relaxed warrior aesthete personality. They're warriors, but they also read poetry on the side and drink wine. And he's like, I'm out there in the trenches, and it shows. But he has the same type of accessories and accoutrements, and it's a beautiful painting. It's actually done a little bit. I'm not sure about these dates, but I think it might be a little bit later. You can tell because of the edges of the form are not as modulated in a 3-dimensional frame. They're much more stiff and abstract and have very rigid lines. And so it might be just a tad later than that. But he has all of the aspects that you would expect from an emperor's profile painting. And in addition, the halo, which becomes so important. Now, I know that this must have been done. I can almost imagine this must have been done after Aurangzeb's death. Why? Because he did not like this type of otherworldliness that equated them with sacred power. He did not like that. He was modest. He was really a Sufi throughout and did not create extravagances like his father and his grandfather before him, etc. But what you do notice is the same patina background, which, as you can see, is less in its robust quality that we saw in earlier paintings. So that's another way to interpret that. The other aspect that also puts Jahanara on a high level, in a hierarchical order in her father's thinking, is the weighing ceremony. Here is Jahangir weighing Shah Jahan on his birthday. And you may have seen paintings like this. Whatever weight he has in gold coins is what's distributed to the community and to the poor. And so that was their giving of alms on the birthday, being thankful that they made it to another year, and then celebrating by giving these coins. And in Shah Jahan's biography, he actually talks about weighing Jahanara on her birthday, weighing her in a similar scale, and then giving alms to the weight of her, whatever her weight is. So that's another aspect of how he held her in high esteem in terms of sharing that power that he had as the emperor of this Mughal empire. And just one more painting that you may come across. This is Dara Shikoh, who's the heir apparent. And again, he is, sitting in conversation with musicians, with wine, but also with Sufi saints. Dara Shikoh is Jahanara's brother, and he introduced her to Sufism and to this mystical aspect of Islam. Now, why was that an important detail? So Jahanara comes into her position when her mother, Mumtaz Mahal, for whom of course the Taj Mahal is built, she dies in childbirth. And she dies giving birth to her 14th child. I would want to die too. Just saying. But she dies, and Jahanara's the oldest daughter, and she's 17, she takes over her role. And this is her brother, who's only about 2 years younger to her. So they're very close. And Dara Shikoh is already fully immersed in a mystical framework. And Shah Jahan just loses his wife, who he was so close to, who was so endearing to him, and he adored and loved and was so beautiful and all that. And he starts to mourn her loss, and he starts to blame himself for her death. He says, because I'm un-Islamic, because I've been a bad Muslim, because I drink wine, because I make people bow to me, like all these things is why God took her away from me. So right away, after the 90 days of mourning, he becomes a lot more orthodox in his thinking, and he really starts to prescribe to a much more orthodox Islam. So his heir apparent is like, oh no, not for me. I'm going to go to this mystical aspect of Islam, not because they don't like orthodoxy, but it's really foreign to them. It's not their lineage. It's not their heritage. When they were Timurids, the Sufi saints were part and parcel to their campaign and to their governance and to their leadership. And also, they were relied upon for social questions, like when should I have a child? Can you pray for a son? Is this a good marriage? the Sufi saints were really their advisors on multiple levels. So Dara Shikoh is really upholding that tradition, whereas Shah Jahan is so overwrought with guilt and is trying to understand the passing of his wife that he decides it's because he's not a good Muslim. And so what happens as a result is that his orthodoxy basically leads to different form of governance, but also when he commissions mosques, he decides that he's going to take exact verses from the Quran to adorn the bands of arches and bands on the architecture of his mosque, whereas Jahanara and Dara Shikoh are practicing what they came from as Timurids, which is Persian poetry on a mosque. And that's coming up, so just keep that in mind, please. And this is Chishti also, and this is from an album, and here he is, Chishti, holding the globe, on top of which, of course, is the emperor's hat and throne and his crown, etc., where again, this relationship of the Sufi and the sovereign is clear in these paintings. We do have this one painting, or actually a drawing in a book, and the book, we're not sure if this is of Jahanara and of Mullah Shah in a conversation possibly about Sufism, which of course she was a huge devotee, but many scholars have been led to believe that it probably is. And the reason for that is because this portrait, or this profile portrait of this man, is so similar to Mullah Shah's paintings, and I'm going to show you one that's, here it is. Here's Mullah Shah. This painting is in the Sackler Museum. It is absolutely stunning, and it shows him with all of his accessories that a Sufi saint would have. And by the way, you often know Sufi saints because they tie their legs like this and sit in this position for hours and hours and hours and hours to show this element of withstanding and willpower of withstanding pain. But if you look at this figure, this is an older version of this guy. And very similar, the sharp-edged features, the sharp nose, the long angled beard is very similar to this gentleman and this figure. And it is likely that an older attendant would be present during this type of conversation, this type of master-disciple relationship, along with attendants who would be needed to bring things. And so you can imagine, and which is why I put this, because this is still speculative, you can imagine that this is her sitting outside, from the confines of, away from the confines of the palace and in nature, and talking about the mystical aspect of Islam. Now, this brings us, we've done enough of the Mughal aspect, but I wanted to also just, before we go into this, actually let's go back to this. Before we go into the architecture that she commissioned, I did want to talk and quote some of the elements from her Sufi autobiographical treatise so that you can see what she wrote and how she wrote it in conjunction with also Sufi ideology. That she's speaking of herself, but she's using the Sufi language to speak of herself, but also speak of Sufism and spiritual authority. So she writes, "In our family, no one took the step on the path to seek God or the truth that would light the Timurid lamp eternally. I was grateful for having received this great fortune and wealth. There was no end to my happiness." End of quote. So by getting on this path, the Sufi path, she's basically saying that she is the light of the Timuria, which of course are their heritage as Mughals. So she's saying that eternal light is achieved through my religiosity, to my piety, to my supporting Mullah Shah, to my writing these books. It's because of me I can light this light eternally. Now, this concept of light, This effulgence of light can be associated with a halo. Someone's emanating that light. But it also is specific to the light that Timur himself spoke of in his biography, which was the Zafarnama before Babur, where he actually says that they are endowed with this effulgence, this sacred light, and it is their duty to keep it lit and to keep it bright. So the fact that she's writing this one element speaks of not only has she read all these biographies, but she knows this concept. She is clear on it, and now she's the keeper of the flame, and she's keeping it lit. She goes further, actually, and she says that after lighting the Timurid lamp, Jahanara basically claims that she can now claim her rightful place on the same mantle, and this is a bit heretical, as the Prophet Muhammad, his revered companions, and Mullah Shah. And I'm going to quote from the book. She says, even though it is not acceptable for a fakira, and fakir, the word fakir is from Persian, and it means the lowliest of persons who is a beggar almost, like so low that has absolutely nothing. And when you start a book, like in any manner, you basically become completely self-effacing to show that you're very humble and you don't have this right, but here I go anyway, right? So you have to say that. So she says, even though it is not acceptable for a fakira to talk about oneself, since meeting the others in my spiritual reverie last night, so she's talking about a dream that she had, and being blessed with eternal happiness, I need to include myself among the zumra of this group. And zumra, I left in Persian because it is the mantle. It means on the same plane, on the same field. End of quote. So Jahanara's elevated status is substantiated further, not only by herself saying like, hey, I have this spiritual authority, I have this elevated consciousness, but it is also substantiated by Mullah Shah's biographer, who was also his student, and that guy's name was Tawakkul Beg, and he writes, the princess who uses her spiritual agency to the extent that she can light the light of the Timuriya could easily be the successor to Mullah Shah if she was not a woman. End of quote. So we have these two legitimizing aspects. She is claiming it for herself, but she is also substantiated through the biographer's writings. Now, here we go. So she hangs out quite a bit up in Kashmir. And because the Kashmir, which is in the northern part of India, and as you know, it's a contested part because half is in Pakistan, half is in India, etc. And they hang out, that was the playground, the pastoral getaway for the Mughals, to go to north in the summer, especially when the heat was horrible. And because it's so removed and it's so remote, you know, it had more of a provincial hold on the power of the Mughals. But she would go there like the others and hang out there, and Akbar had already built a fort up there, and she gets to study with Mullah Shah up there. And her brother is there. He has a library up there. He's built quite a bit up there. So she comes back and she's full of these sacred aspects and spiritual reveries. And she comes back and one of the vassals tells Shah Jahan, hey, you know, a lot of people are dying on the street. And I'm sorry, I have to go back to this image because I didn't read. They're dying on the street, on this street, because this is a very heavily trafficked road, and it is the road that connects, modern-day Pakistan, but Kabul, Afghanistan, and beyond, and all the traders are coming through this road, and people are going this way, and people are going this way, and people are getting killed. I mean, there's no traffic lights or these types of things. So he's like, we've got to do something. And he said, okay, I'll make a little forecourt so that things are a little manageable. And Jahanara says, wait, further, I want to make a mosque. If there's all these travelers coming through and they're Muslim, I want to give them something. I want to show, I want to perform my benevolence by giving them a mosque that they can stop, wash themselves, rest, pray, etc. And that, of course, is another charge. It's a requirement of the imperial elite to donate this type, to show this type of philanthropy to their servants. And so she says, and this, of course, as I said, was recorded in his biography. So now let's go back, and here it is. And so she creates this. She wants to build this congregation mosque, and this happens, in 1648. It's actually started in 1644, and what's happening is that in 1639, actually 1640, 38 to 40, Taj Mahal is finally complete, and that's just down the street in Agra. This is also in Agra, and this building here. And so the same artisans who just worked on Taj Mahal are now coming to build this. What's interesting about this mosque is that it has not the multi-cusped arches that I showed you earlier, which were very Mughalized. It has the Persianate arches that are much more wide and have a keel arch as opposed to the multi-cusped arch. So it's a very wide arch that is much more Persian than it is Indian. And also she has this herringbone pattern on top of the domes, and that also is very specific to the Timurid style of decoration, and is hardly seen anywhere in the Mughal landscape in any of their commissions. And further, you can see that the entire building is made of red sandstone, and it does, of course, have trimmings that are marble, but it's not marble like the Taj Mahal. It is much more stark and Cistercian, if you will, than compared to the opulence of the Taj Mahal. So she comes down and she decides that she wants to build this congregation mosque, and later she goes back up to Srinagar in Kashmir and dedicates another mosque to Mullah Shah. And this is the mosque up in Kashmir. You already can see the different styles because, of course, of the material that's available in Kashmir. And, but you can still see that it has the Shah Jahani elements. And that's very important to understand, that that this architecture and these elements are still using and accessing the reservoir of symbols and iconography and architecture that Shah Jahan is building all over India at this time, at least northern India, and specifically in his seat of government. He's using this Persianate arch, he's using the multi-cusped arch, and this is called a pishtak, and the pishtak is a high arched portal that leads to the mihrab. And the mihrab is the niche where a cleric will stand to lead the prayer. And that mihrab, is existentially is the gate to heaven, but it really is pointing to Mecca. So it tells you the direction of prayer. So even if this mosque is closed, which mosques don't close, even if you were outside, all you have to do is find the mihrab, even on the outside, because it has a little protuberance on the outside, and you can figure out, travelers who want to know, like, where's the direction of prayer? They don't have iPhones with compasses, so they have to find direction, and so they can do that. So she comes back and she builds this mosque, and you can see this is an old, this is in the Kinari Bazaar in Roshan Mohalla, and it is a photograph from the British Library, and you can see that what kind of presence this would have had in a bazaar that was used by the commoners. I mean, this is where the commoners shop. The elite aren't coming here to shop. So it stands high above and proud and on this podium of sorts to represent this power, and she's using all the elements that of course speak of Shah Jahan, and yet it's her patronage. And this is an old map of Agra on cloth. If you have a chance to go there, it's wonderful. It's so highly detailed because even the plans of the buildings are shown here. And so this is her mosque right here, and this is the forecourt that Shah Jahan built so that the traffic would be a little bit more manageable, and of course this is the Red Fort. And here is another archaeological survey photograph. I show you this because in the mutiny of 1848, the British actually holed up across from this on the Red Fort, whereas the revolutionaries used the mosque, and there used to be a rampart right here. It started from here and it ended here. There was a wall here, like a fort wall, and the British knocked it down so that they wouldn't have a place to defend, to defend themselves. So it no longer is there, but it used to be there. And here is the plan and the elevation, and I want to speak of something very specific, and that has to do with this inscription that is on the panel when you enter at the Pishtaq. And why I circled this, I don't know how many of you can read Persian or Arabic or Urdu, but here is Jim, Ha, Noon, Aleph, and Ra, Jahanara. That means it's right there. It's emblazoned for anyone to know and see. Okay. Could I finish this one thing and then, okay. And then of course Shah Jahan's name is just up here as well. So again, the optical politics in terms of inscription are clear. It's an equally weighted power. But let me just read how she has been integrated. Her persona is enunciated through this very bold praise of the details of the mosque, but using the details of herself. So the inscription in here says, the Jami Masjid, and Jami means congregation. Okay, so that means every Friday, this is where all of the commoners, whoever wants to, come together and pray here. So it's going to be publicly seen and with frequency. So it says, the Jami Masjid was built by her order, who is high in dignity, who is as elevated as the firmament on which it sits, screened with curtains, bright as the sun, possessing a glorious palace as illuminated as her wisdom, veiled with chastity, the most revered of the ladies of the age, the pride of her gender, the princess of the realm, the possessor of the three domes, as worldly crowns, the chosen of the people of the world, the most honored of the issue of the head of the faithful, and then Jahanara Begam. End of quote. So I guess I have to stop.